Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a Friday Reads. I didn't do one last week, so there's quite a few books to get through. The shorter writings of Franz Kafka, with introduction by Joshua Cohen, translated by two of the all-time great translators of Kafka, Willa Muir and Edwin Muir, Ethan Wilkins and Ernst Kaiser, Joseph Kresch, Tanya Stern and James Stern, and Clement Greenberg. My first ever novel from Greenland. This is Crimson by Niviaq Korneliussen. Another from Scandinavia, Agnes Ravatn, The Seven Doors. This was her latest book, came out in English translation last week. Non-fiction, Anna MacDonald, Between the Word and the World. One, written by Blake Butler and Vanessa Place, assembled by Christopher Higgs. I will explain what that means when I come to it. This is Anna MacDonald, she of the essays, A Jealous Tide, her debut novel, and finally Homie by Danez Smith, poetry. I'm going to start very briefly with the Kafka because it won't take long. So I was very excited to hear that there was coming out this year a book of shorter writings of Franz Kafka, so I assume that would be sort of fragments and stuff, but I actually discovered no, most of this is already contained in the complete short stories, which is a Random House vintage collection which I read a few years ago, so I was slightly disappointed in that. But having said that, the 6-page introductory essay by Joshua Cohen, he of the Book of Numbers and Moving Kings and other books, is quite interesting. I mean, it's quite an interesting take on Kafka, and also quite provocative in literature and identity, or writing and identity. But also, there were some that I hadn't come across before, this being Kafka. This is Leopards in the Temple, just over 3 lines. Leopards break into the temple and drink to the dregs what is in the sacrificial pitchers. This is repeated over and over again. Finally, it can be calculated in advance, and it becomes part of the ceremony. So, you know, if you're really interested in Kafka, I would say get the complete. If you're like me, you've sort of read everything. There are 1 or 2 real nuggets that I hadn't come across before in this, but slightly, I assume that, you know, where I saw that there were, you know, short stories that I'd read before, I assume maybe these were earlier drafts and stuff, because Kafka never went to print, apart from a couple of sort of published stories published in journals. That basically everything was handwritten and hand edited. So I assumed that there might be some sort of earlier versions of the famous short stories, but I don't think that's the case. Okay, so on to my first novel from Greenland. This was sent to me as part of my annual subscription to the Big Green Bookshop, where they sort of pick titles based on a sort of general blurb of my reading taste that I sent them before the year started. It hasn't been very successful, but this I'm very grateful for, because I never would have heard of this book, come across this book. It's not a perfect book, but it won me over. So it's about 5 characters in Greenland. I assume they're all in their 20s. We have a brother and a sister, the roommate that the sister lives with, and then we have a lesbian couple, and each get their own sort of chapter. And there's a lot of gender fluidity in here, so even some of those labels may not stick. And the first one is about the sister, and it's not a coming out story to anybody yet. She's not coming out to like parents or anything, but it's sort of her first lesbian experience or lesbian crush, and it was pretty much ho-hum really. Not a great start, I thought. So for example, she sort of is attracted to this woman called Sarah, who's one of the lesbian couple. She smiles and seems charmed by my reply, but then straightens her back when she sees Arnak next to me. We were on our way home. See you again soon, she says. No, fuck, no, please don't leave me. Stay by my side, don't go away. Let me touch you, let me kiss you, let me take you home to my place. No fucking way, no, don't disappear. You'll smash me into a million pieces if you disappear. You'll knock me down just when I finally stood up. You're killing me now that I've come alive again. Please, oh God, please don't leave me again. So, you know, that sort of quickened breath, or, you know, quickened thoughts, the panic, of being abandoned or walked out on. You kind of seen it done 1,000 times before, and I thought, oh, you know, this is a bit kind of bog standard. But then we move into the brothers section, which starts off with him in jail. He breaks out, flees to Denmark, where he, you know, I assume he feels he won't be caught. And then in sort of epistolary fashion, he sends letters to his sister, to Arnak, the woman who was his best friend and who is the roommate of his sister. And he's very angry at betrayal of a secret by Arnak. He's very angry with Greenland, but he doesn't feel at home in Denmark. You know, racial. I don't know what the racial difference between Greenland and Denmark is. I mean, I know Denmark used to own Greenland, but he feels that he's, you know, all Danes see him as obviously from Greenland just because of his physical appearance. So it's not home. But the interesting thing is when he's slagging off Greenland, he's sort of slagging it off as sort of being obsessed with sort of queer politics and how that sort of degraded the sort of the spirit of the Greenlanders. It's very interesting, but it's very conflicted. Again, there's this sort of gender fluidity running through his story. Then we come to Arnak, who's the woman he claims betrayed him, who's basically someone who's just out for a good time. She has no sort of loyalties or allegiances. She'll sleep with anybody. And then we move on to the lesbian couple. We get each of their points of view as their relationship is collapsing. I don't want to spoil the really ingenious sort of psychological revelation contained within that. So by the end, this book had definitely won me over from that not very promising start. So 4 stars. The Seven Doors by Agnes Ravatn. An author introduced me by Bookish North and Cilia. This is, I'm told, her more usual genre, which is sort of mystery. So we have a grandmother who is a lecturer in English literature at university, who has had the ground pulled out from under her as her childhood home, in which she is still living, has always lived her whole life, has been compulsorily purchased to make way for a new transport link. So she's feeling very discombobulated. And as part of that, she appears on a panel where she sort of says, oh, policemen aren't intellectually, you know, smart enough to really get to grips with crime. You know, they don't think about the sort of the human condition and how humans operate, that the best detectives would be writers and literary critics. This gets publicised in the national press and, you know, makes life a bit difficult for her. And then whether wittingly or unwittingly, she sort of follows up that argument through deed, in that a female tenant with a young child in her rental house disappears, and she kind of gets on the case, and it's very interesting. I found this with Karen Fossen, that Norwegian women crime writers are very, very subtle in what they do outside of the crime. You know, what the context is, what's going on in people's lives around and consequent of the crime, rather than the grisly details of the crime itself. We don't know if there is a crime here, because the woman's disappeared. But here, you know, there's a hilarious, you know, she's in amongst sort of pursuing the fate of this woman. You know, she's having to find a new house, and there's a hilarious scene where, because the legend of Bluebeard, or is it Blackbeard? I can never remember. Anyway, the one who had sort of all these sort of locked doors in his house, and so his wife could go into any of them but one, and of course she goes in and finds the grisly secret. That plays a key motif in this book. So the grandmother character is walking through a new build house, reciting the Bluebeard legend of all these secret locked doors when she's going through doors in a house. So there's some really sort of cute stuff about that. There's also the fact that, you know, the woman has disappeared, and she can't help referring to her as was, when of course she may just, you know, she very well maybe still is. So she sort of keeps having to pick herself up on saying, no, not was, is. But then she gets into, because she's a detective plain detective, looking back in the past life of this woman to try and find clues as to her whereabouts and her fate. was actually becomes quite an important, the imperative tense becomes quite important, because at each change and shift in this benighted woman's life, the victim, not the detective figure, she closes one door of her life. So she no longer does that. But before that, she was that type of person. She was a violinist. She was an unmarried mother. All these sorts of things. So actually, the imperfect tense is corrected. She discovers it's actually corrected in a lot of ways. So it's a really fiendishly clever, I think. It's clever. It's not really about the mystery element. It's not about the fate of the woman. It's much more about the emotions and the discombobulation and the little delusions. Her delusion that she could be better than the police because she's a teacher of comparative literature. And the end surprised me. The reveal of who's in the frame, as it were, for the fate of the woman surprised me. I didn't see it coming. I kept guessing. I kept changing my guesses as each one that I guessed, Ravatn then revealed was not the perpetrator, and I didn't guess at all the person. So that was a good read. And on to a book of essays, Between the Word and the World by MacDonald. And I'm going to start with the epigram that gives you the thesis of this book. It's from John Berger, who wrote Ways of Seeing. The third dimension, the solidity of the chair, the body, the tree, is, at least as far as our senses are concerned, the very proof of our existence. It constitutes the difference between the word and the world. And this book, basically, I think, is an attempt to explore that. But I don't think it's sort of consistent in that thesis. I think it's much more impressionistic. It's not a rigorous explanation. It's very much sort of based on her own musings, her own reading. There's a lot of booktube darlings are referred to in here. Samantha Schweblin, Olivia Lang, Ali Smith, Valeria Luiselli, plus some writers I hadn't heard of, and has led me to go out and buy. So this is a novel called OK Mr. Field by Catherine Kivalia. I haven't read it yet. So, it's quite interesting on the kind of book cited front. Some essays were better than others. There's a really good one on the concept of home and feeling unhomed. I thought that was very good. There's this, again, relying on John Berger, who was talking about drawing. I now began to see the white surface of the paper on which I was going to draw in a different way. From being a clean, flat page, it became an empty space. Its whiteness became an area of limitless opaque light, possible to move through but not to see through. I knew that when I drew a line on it or through it, I should have to control the line, not like the driver of a car on one plane, but like a pilot in the air, movement in all three dimensions being possible. And then MacDonald's comment on that is, I cannot overstate the feeling of vertigo triggered by the possibility of moving through the page in all three dimensions, as she reads. It is a feeling akin to reading Saybold and Cole, although I wonder if the pages they inhabit were ever empty to begin with. The palimpsestic nature of their work would suggest perhaps not, being as they are already peopled by Wittgenstein and Benjamin, by Holmes and Baldwin, and already placed on the Gemmi Pass and other alpine territories. But at heart these narratives are multiple and three-dimensional. They force the reader to look at the world before them, even when that world is presented, quote, obliquely, tangentially, by reference rather than direct confrontation, as Saybold once described it in an interview with Michael Silverblatt. Books that can be, demand to be read in this way, are inherently terrestrial. They create a multi-dimensional world via the page that has the potential to intervene in the so-called real world beyond it. So again, it's that what contribution does writing and literature make to our daily existence and reality? I'm not sure that that's ever really cleared up in this book. And I do have to say, from my point of view, it gets off to a really bad start because she talks about psychogeography, particularly around rivers and water, which is pertinent to the novel of hers I'll come on to review. Because to me, psychogeography is just creating myths where myths haven't even existed before. It's an absolute antithesis of reality. Yes, you may have a personal emotional investment to a place, in her case, to a river in Australia. but it's a personal mythology, not a universal mythology. Therefore, it's purely subjective and has nothing to do with everybody else's reality. So, a mixed bag. I should have mentioned 4 stars for that, 3.5 stars for that. And onto the Blake Butler, Vanessa Place and Christopher Higgs book. I'm just going to read you the preface. It's a much better way of explaining how this book was put together. What you're about to read is the product of a collaborative experiment. What if one writer, Vanessa Place, wrote a narrative composed entirely from the interior landscape of a character, while another writer, Blake Butler, wrote a narrative composed entirely from the exterior landscape of a character, neither writer communicating with the other until both writers gave me their finished product to another writer, Christopher Higgs, who would then assemble the 2 narratives together to form one unified piece. And the only directions that Higgs gave to both writers before they set out to write was first person, present tense, 40 to 60 pages, avoid discussing the details with one another. Because I want to avoid prefabricated cohesion, while at the same time I feel the need to offer a framework within which to play, I'll suggest that you think in terms of 3 movements: discovery, secrecy, escape. These need not be sequential. In other words, feel free to think in terms of escape, discovery, secrecy, or whatever arrangement of those you want. My hope is that by suggesting these 3 specific movements, it will give you helpful boundary demarcations, and also allow me to locate common vector points at which I might establish pivots for the final construction. Well, the first thing to say is that secrecy, escape, discovery thing was abandoned pretty quickly. This was so interesting to read, but ultimately didn't really satisfy on any level. I say it was interesting to read because I kept trying to wonder which one of the writers had written this, and that I would have liked to have seen their 40 to 60 page composition, in an appendix or something. There's an interesting throw, which I think has come from Vanessa Place because she has a legal background, about the history of the movement from trial by ordeal and trial by battle and trial by faith to the trial in front of a judge and then on to a trial in front of a jury. And that's really interesting. I would have liked to have read that as an essay, but it's sort of fragmented throughout here. And I didn't really understand how that tied into the emotional journey that was being portrayed. And to be honest, I got a bit lost because there were no handholds. It's not a conventional story. You're not expecting a conventional story, but I couldn't really get to grips with anything because everything was in the now and was either inside or outside. I thought that bit that that both writers stuck to that, but I couldn't. It was too opaque for me, which in a way is inevitable because they were two interwoven narratives that were never speaking to each other in a organised way until a third eye came and sort of spliced them together. But I also wonder at what level the splicing happened. Were there sentences broken open so you had a place first half of the sentence and a second half? I didn't get that sense. I got the sense that the splicing happened at the level of paragraphs, but again, that's another thing I would have liked to have known. So I can't recommend this book except as a really interesting idea and what it delivered. But in terms of sort of satisfactory read, no, I'm afraid it didn't. So 3. And on to the debut novel, A Jealous Tide by Anna MacDonald, which is a very contemplative, meditative novel about a restless soul of the narrator trying to come to rest, trying to find peace and stillness, and completely unable to really, because her temperament and her sensibility is ever shifting. And she starts off, she's sort of doing research into the notion of Virginia Woolf and water, the significance of water. Obviously Woolf drowned herself, but then she moves to being interested from broadening out from Woolf to a wider interest in drowning and suicide. And then from that she shifts into shipwrecks and people being cast adrift on the sea, and kind of what that involved. And all of these are metaphors for her. I mean, she strikes me as quite a depressed character in here, although it's never explicitly stated. And, you know, there's some interesting contemplations, but there's no real move. You know, despite this is the case that someone is adrift or drifting, there's no real sense of movement in here. You know, a lot of the time she retreats back to her bolt hole in London, having come over from Australia, and just sort of, you know, locks herself up. And the two characters that she imagines, this is based on a true story, just after the First World War, when a soldier jumped off the Thames to save a woman who'd fallen into the Thames, and he eventually drowns. She imagines that the woman was committing suicide, and it was was prevented by the action of this soldier, that she was committing suicide because she'd lost sons in the First World War. And she's imagining the soldier, he's not quite shell-shocked, but he's sort of on that spectrum. And both of them at various times just lock themselves up in their rooms, as she does. So but it doesn't feel claustrophobic. You know, that sense of being stuck in your room or having water come over your face as you're drowning, which right at the end we get that imagining of the man once he dives in. But it didn't do a lot for me, really. And there's an awful lot of her dreaming. There's an awful lot of her casting back to memories and associations of rivers in Australia and events in Australia to here. So it's beautifully written. It is contemplative. If you're in that meditative mood, you might get a heck of a lot out of this. For example, Elizabeth at Bookish North, I think you might really like this book. But it wasn't for me, really, so another 3 stars. And then finally, Homie by Danez Smith, who I think is my favourite poet. They identify as they, I ought to say. This is the second collection of theirs, having read Don't Call Us Dead. And Don't Call Us Dead, I think, was very much divided into 3 parts. One was race, one was queerness, and the third was AIDS. AIDS and queerness are in here, but it's very much about race, I feel. And even, I mean, I'm not going to go into it, but he says this book isn't really called Homie. It's called Another Word, which you can read for yourself. He just didn't want white people saying that word. And I think that sort of sets it off. And the first poem is called My Presidents, not Donald Trump, obviously. It's all sorts of Afro-American, both, celebrities, but also ordinary people in his life who, to him, represent, the true nobility and status that should be attended to the role of president. I think, there's anger, but there's also a melancholy about when they're thinking about race. So, for example, there's a poem called Rose where they are casting back to a white schoolmate of theirs who was bullied, and in this poem Rose, they are sort of feeling very regretful and rueful that they were one of several people who bullied Rose, and they wonder what has become of her now. My favourite poem is called Dogs, which has lots of different sort of associations with the word dog, from sort of dog as in D-A-W-G, as in a bunch of homies, to this reference to Richard Pryor. In 97, a black comic gets on stage, says, "You ever notice how white dogs be like woof woof and black dogs be like rough rough motherfucker?" Scooby-Doo was trying to tell us something when every time that monster mask got snatched off, it was a greedy white dude. And there's, sniffer dogs, werewolves. It's just brilliant. The concept of it is so good. Possible rite of passage number 37. Graduating from outrunning the block's dogs to outrunning the block's police. I too been called boy and expected to come heel. So, I think there's a lot of really... The beauty of this book is the combination of idea and image. Each one augments the other. It doesn't overpower it. It's not preachy to the overpowering of the poetry, and it's not too poetic to dilute the message. I think it's really skillful in the way it did that. There's another poem, again, just the level of ideas and association and concepts. And there's a poem here called Self-Portrait as a 19s R&B video, where a lot of the sort of tropes and cliches of MTV videos from the 90s are redefined, you know, in his daily life, in their daily life. So 5 stars, you know, not every poem is a 5-star poem, but overall the collection was 5 stars. So there you have it. That's been my Friday reads for the last couple of weeks. I am about to embark on someone that Anna MacDonald lauds and extols, and that is W.J. Sebald. I'm reading my second Sebald novel, which is The Rings of Saturn, and is another one that counts towards Read More German Lit in 2020. So that's it for this week. Thanks very much. Till next time.